Today, July 12th, marks the 70th anniversary of one of the most spectacular military clashes of all time, the Titanic tank battle between the German and Soviet armies around Prokhorovka, which served as the crescendo of the Battle of Kursk in 1943. I am David Kerans for the Voice of Russia, American Edition, and we take a moment now to assess the meaning of this battle.
Играй, мой баян, и скажи всем друзьям, отважным и смелым в бою, что как подругу мы родину любим свою.
To set the scene, in the summer of 1943, the war between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, the most gigantic war in history, was entering its third year. For the first year and a half, the German army routed the Soviets in most engagements, piled up huge tallies of prisoners, occupied the lion's share of the European part of the USSR, imposed punishing burdens on the populations of the captured territories, and commenced programs of genocide against portions of that population. In the winter of 1942-43, however, the Soviet army rebalanced the struggle with an enormous victory in the Battle of Stalingrad. The summer of 1943 promised to be decisive, and the Germans built up a huge arsenal of new and improved armored vehicles to bolster a massive offensive against the salient in the front line around the central Russian city of Kursk. The pivotal moment in this offensive was the huge tank battle around Prokhorovka, which effectively broke the German offensive. Joining us now to discuss the wider meaning of the Battle of Kursk is David Stahel, a very experienced researcher of the German-Soviet War. And David, I'd like to begin by asking you where you situate the Battle of Kursk when you survey the whole course of this colossal war.
Well, I think the first thing to be said is that there's a number of key turning points that people identify in terms of trying to figure out where did this war shift and what was moving this war. And I think Kursk, in that sense, is one of these key turning points. The first one, of course, is Moscow. That's the first turning point people identify in the winter of 1941-42. Stalingrad is the great turning point that people focus on, and, of course, Kursk itself. I think the reason why Kursk is so significant and why people direct so much attention toward that battle is the fact that this is really where the German initiative is lost. It's also the first summer offensive that they launch which isn't spectacularly successful. They don't take tremendous amounts of territory. They don't crush Soviet armies. It's very much an attritional battle. But I think beyond all of that, we really have to stay focused on strategic factors in terms of positioning this battle. And in that sense, I think we shouldn't focus too much on the battlefield itself. I think we really need to understand that battles don't take place in a vacuum, and that this is very much a battle of attrition. It's not a blitzkrieg anymore. By 1943, these two great colossus are really butting up against each other. And even when the Soviets are on the offensive for the rest of 1943 and indeed the rest of the war, it's still very attritional. They haven't yet perfected this operational art to the extent that the Germans had it in 1941. Right. There aren't great encirclements until really the middle of 1944. And I think if you look at other strategic factors, principally economic factors, and just how much Allied material was being produced, really in that sense, Kursk loses a degree of meaning, because ultimately whether 100 extra German tanks went this way or that, does that really determine the outcome of the battle? I think not.
Right. I think it's an important point you make that the war had changed in character from one of movement and blitzkrieg to one of attrition. Really did affect the outcome thereafter. Can I ask you, when we try to make sense of the sweep of events, we can't fit them all. We can't fit all turning points into a timeline or pin them onto spots on a map. Some turning points are more subtle. And I mention this perspective by way of asking you if these two supposedly rigid totalitarian systems, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, somehow changed during the war, such that by 1943, about when this shift from blitzkrieg to attrition you've mentioned takes place, if their relative abilities to organize and lead armies was not what it had been when the war began in 1941.
Oh, I think that's very true. I think that there is a a huge shift that's taken place, and it's taken place on a lot of different levels. Principally, I think for Nazi Germany, they have lost any real strategic character. I mean, they started with very little, I think, to begin with. At least it was very unrealistic what they started with. But I think what we see that by the end of 1942, or the end of the Stalingrad, the Battle of Stalingrad, there isn't really any strategic focus for the Germans, not at any level. The German generals don't really have a solution. The solution is hold the Eastern Front and launch offensives wherever they can, which is really quite a forlorn strategy, but it's the only strategy they have because there's simply no room in this Nazi ideology for any notion of defeat or surrender. And as we know from 1944 and 1945, as that notion is raised by some very bold generals to Hitler, it's very quickly dismissed. So, strategic focus for the Germans is lacking. And in the Soviet context, I think it's also changed a great deal, but it changes, I think, in the most important sense right at the beginning. Stalin very much dominates the decision-making process in the Soviet Union, and of course, he's dominated it to the detriment of the Soviet Union, both before Barbarossa begins, when he denies these warnings that he's receiving, and indeed afterwards, when he's taking control of a lot of the military decisions. And I think the key one there in 1941 is the Battle of Kiev, where he basically insists on holding the city against prevailing military advice. Right. And ultimately, when the city is taken, and not just the city is taken, but the central part of Ukraine is lost, and 5 Soviet armies are destroyed. Yes. This is a calamity. And what he takes away from that is this idea that he's got to take more notice of his commanders in a way that Hitler doesn't. And indeed, from that same battle, Hitler learns the opposite lesson. His generals have been arguing against this operation in the Ukraine. He overrules them, and it's a spectacular success, 650,000 Soviet prisoners of war. Right. So he takes away from that this idea that he can run this war and he knows better than his generals. Stalin learns the other lesson. And indeed, if we go back to the Battle of Kursk, we see that very clearly for Stalin, that before the summer offensive begins for the Germans, he's keen to launch an offensive, a preemptive offensive himself. But Vasilevsky and Zhukov talk him out of it. And he's prepared to be talked out of it because he's recognizing, and it's not the first time since the Battle of Kiev in 1941, that some of his military commanders know a lot better what should be Soviet strategy than he does.
Right. Yeah, the leader's relative ability to learn or not learn from their experiences of battle is obviously critical. The outcome here is important insights. The ability of these countries to adapt to the military and economic requirements of total war, especially for the USSR amid the devastation that the war visited on the country, is a very rich theme, of course. But in our remaining time, as we commemorate the Battle of Kursk now, I'd like to ask you for just a few thoughts regarding the significance of Kursk to the outcome of the entire Second World War.
I think there's I think that the jury is out for me on that. I think it's got an iconic status for a lot of people. And certainly looking at more German history, which is what I work in, there's a tendency to revisit Kursk again and again and to go over, particularly the Battle of Pokrovka, where hundreds of tanks clash together, and it's got to become this iconic battle of not just Kursk, but of the whole Eastern Front. Armored clashes, and we get wonderfully detailed accounts coming out about this, which I don't want to say aren't relevant. They're very important to have in and of themselves, but I think the problem there is a lot of people reading these kinds of accounts attribute to Kursk a certain importance that as if only one decision had been made, or if an extra 100 tanks had been here or there. Remember, this is a battle that's also remembered because there's the first Tiger tanks and Panther tanks coming on. And I think people therefore have this idea that Kursk has this potential significance that if only the battle had gone somehow differently, things could have been very different for Hitler's war, perhaps in 1943, and ultimately much longer. And that's not the case. It's actually a fallacy. If you focus again on the first part of our discussion, looking at these strategic factors. I mean, in 1942, just to give one fact, the Soviet Union produces 24,000 tanks, and Allied total, Britain, the United States, produced 57,000 tanks in that year alone. Germany in 1942 produced 9,000 tanks. So they're being outproduced 6-1. And when we fast forward up to the summer of 1943, and we asked that question, what is the significance of Kursk? Yes, it's a significant battle. Yes, it matters very much to study it and to understand what exactly happened and why the armies went there and how they fought and so on. But it shouldn't be taken in a strategic context, as it often is, as somehow this knife-edge battle upon which the ability for Hitler and his armies to maintain the initiative in the East hinged, because that's not the case. This battle is important, but it's not decisive in the progress of the Second World War.
David Stahel, we're very appreciative for the broader insights. We thank you for joining us.
Most welcome. Thank you very much.
We have more on the Kursk battle on our website, voicerussia.com, including an in-depth interview about Kursk with the famous historian of the German-Soviet War, David Kerans. Voice of Russia, I am David Kerans.
За родину, за нас с тобою битва. И где-то здесь героев рубежи, которых мы так редко вспоминаем.